The recipients of the letter to the Hebrews had a very serious problem. The problem is they were reverting to Judaism. They had become Christians, and they were excited about that for a time. They were very zealous about their faith in Christ for a time, but then troubles came. Problems came. And those problems came in different forms, but one of those problems that they were dealing with was suffering and persecution at the hands of their former Jewish brethren. If you look in Hebrews chapter 10, start reading at verse 32, where the writer says, "But remember the former days when, after being enlightened," that is, after you came to Christ, after you came to truth, "you endured a great conflict of sufferings, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations, and partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. For you showed sympathy to the prisoners and accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised." You see, these Hebrews were giving up on Jesus because they started facing persecution. Their property was being plundered. Their possessions were being taken. They were being imprisoned. They were being beaten. And they began to draw back. They were thinking to themselves, it would be a lot easier for us. Life wouldn't be so bad if we would just renounce this Christianity thing and go back to Judaism. We wouldn't have all these problems anymore. And so the Hebrew writer writes them this long letter, and he is begging them and urging them, making a passionate plea to them and saying, don't go back. You need to see how much better you have it in Jesus Christ. I know things are hard. I know that you're struggling and you're suffering, but don't go back. Because what is ahead of you is eternal. What's ahead of you is so much greater than whatever benefit you might gain from renouncing your faith in Jesus Christ. So really their problem was spiritual instability. They had resolved to become Christians, as we talked about last month, resolved to follow Jesus, resolved to make the commitment to be Christians, and then resolved to stay true to that commitment, determined to follow through with that commitment, and that's where they were struggling. They made that initial commitment, but they weren't staying with it. They weren't showing that necessary determination to stay with it. And so the writer says, you are being unstable, and you need to remember your faith. But spiritual instability can be a problem for you and I as well, can't it? We have problems, we have troubles of various kinds, and that can weigh on us, that can affect our spiritual life in very harmful ways. And so as we think about that this morning, as we talk about faith and getting back to the solid foundation that we began on, I want to begin this morning by asking a question. And the question that I want to begin with you this morning is this: what is it that makes you spiritually unstable? Have you ever had a season of life where you were spiritually unstable? Have you ever had a time period in your life where you were wavering in your faith? Why? What led to you being spiritually unstable? And there may be a number of things that lead to that. Let me suggest to us that sometimes it's the trials that we go through in life. Maybe it's the ongoing temptations that we deal with in life. And those trials and those temptations can make us unstable. Turn over a few pages to James, the first chapter. James chapter 1, there's a lengthy discussion about the trials that we go through in life and the temptations that we deal with in life. And this is familiar territory for most of us, I think. So we're not going to analyze this chapter, but just notice some things that James talks about. He begins his book right out of the gate after the introduction in verse 1. The very first thing he talks about is the trials that we go through. And he tells us to consider it all joy when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And we've talked before about what a backwards instruction that is. that it's not natural for us to think about our problems and our trials that way. But I just want to point out to you that it's interesting that that's the very first thing James says in his book. James recognizes that trials and struggles are commonplace to every Christian. And so that's a great place to begin his book. Everybody deals with trials at some point in life. Everybody deals with temptations and problems throughout their lives. This is one of the most common things that we all experience. And James says, we might as well start talking right there. So as we think about our trials in life, whatever those may be, whether it's chronic sickness or loss of a job or financial strain or financial problems, disappointments with our own selves, maybe disappointments with other people, our trials come in various forms. But James says that we need to see those as opportunities to increase our faith rather than things that will make it shrink. If you drop down in chapter 1, and if you look at verse 12, he says, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. For once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised him." But now James is going to transition from trials and struggles in life to then talking about a more specific type of trial, and he talks about the temptations that we deal with. So he says in verse 13, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God." He says in verse 14, "Each one is tempted when he is carried away and he is enticed by his own lust. And then when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brethren." I don't know what your temptations are. I know what mine are. But you have temptations that you deal with on a regular, ongoing basis, don't you? I know I do. All of us do. And sometimes we get so overwhelmed when those temptations come upon us that we give in. We surrender to Satan's temptations. And then when we do that, we come out on the other side and we just want to beat ourselves up because we say, man, I did it again. I gave in again. I have failed God again. And I want to tell you, if you do that enough, it's going to lead you to spiritual instability. It's going to lead you to a season of depression, a season of hopelessness or helplessness. And so when we think about what makes us spiritually unstable, I think this needs to be at the top of the list. Trials and temptations that we deal with. Here's a second thing that I think makes us spiritually unstable, and that is the choices that we make. You know, the book of Proverbs, not in this passage, it's on the screen, but in another place, the book of Proverbs says that the way of the transgressor is hard. The way of the transgressor is difficult. And what that simply says is that we make choices in life. And when we choose to do what's sinful, when we choose to follow the wrong path, our life becomes more difficult. Our life becomes more challenging. Now let's look at this passage in Proverbs on the screen together. Proverbs chapter 4. I love the language of this passage. Proverbs 4 talks about the paths that we all choose in life. In Proverbs chapter 4, begin at verse 14, where he says, "Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not proceed in the way of evil men." Then you drop down to verse 18, and it says, "But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, that shines brighter and brighter until the full day. The way or the path of the wicked is like the darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." Isn't verse 18 just an encouraging verse? Don't you love that language? The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, like the sun coming up in the morning that shines brighter and brighter until high noon. That's just beautiful language that says when we choose the righteous path, when we choose to follow God and do what God wants us to do, we are abundantly blessed by doing that. But when we make poor choices, those poor choices can lead us to spiritual instability. One of those poor choices that we make is unwise relationships and the peers that we associate with. You don't need to turn to this passage, do you? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 53, we've all been quoting it since we were children. "Do not be deceived, evil company corrupts good morals." And we give lip service to that passage. We can quote it, we can say it, we know the fundamental truth of it is right, and yet, oh, that boy's just so cute. I really want to go out with him, even though he's not the best person for me to be going out with. Or that girl, she's really beautiful, even though she's not the best person for me to be associating with. And I know my friends, they use foul language, but you know what? That doesn't affect me. I can overcome that. I can filter that out. That's not going to bother me. I just want to go hang out with them for a little while. And it just begins to rub off on us. But whatever the reason we have seasons of spiritual instability, if we're going to remain steadfast and immovable, as our theme for the year suggests, it starts with having a strong faith. The kind of a faith, as we sang about just before the sermon. The kind of faith that will help us overcome during trials and temptations. The kind of faith that will give us the perspective to think about the results of our choices even before we make them. The kind of a faith that will say, you know what, this person is probably not the kind of person I need to have in my life. And so I'm not going to be around that person. Having a solid foundation of faith is really the only way for us to remain stable. Go back to the book of Hebrews now with me. I want to go back to chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. And really this morning, we're going to be studying primarily from Hebrews chapter 11. But I needed to lay a little bit of groundwork from Hebrews, the 10th chapter. Because, and this is going to really blow your minds when I say this, the 11th chapter follows the 10th chapter. And there's some stuff in the 10th chapter that's pretty important to help us understand the 11th chapter, okay? Now, Hebrews chapter 10, he has just told them, as we read a moment ago, he says, you think about your former times when you became a Christian, but then your life really got difficult. And then he says in verse 35, don't throw away your confidence. Don't throw away your boldness and your commitment to Jesus, because if you do that, you're going to give up on the reward that God has in store for you. And so he says in verse 36, what you need is endurance. If you're going to make it through, you need endurance. And then verse 39, he says, but we are not of those who shrink back to destruction, but we are of those who have faith to the preservance of the soul. We don't want to be people who shrink back. And what he means by that is we don't want to be people whose faith shrinks. We want to be people whose faith gets larger and stronger. We don't want to be people who shrink back. If you go into chapter 11 and verse 6, the writer says, without faith, it is impossible to be pleasing to God. And so if we're going to come to God and be right with Him, it starts with us having faith, but not just little faith. Not weak faith. Let us never be content with that. We don't want faith that shrinks back and cowers in these seasons of spiritual instability. We want a faith that is strong and ever increasing. So let me suggest to us that spiritual instability often comes when we're uncertain about the future. Think back to our previous slide about the things that make us spiritually unstable. So think about trials. Maybe we've made some bad choices that have put us into a trying situation. We've chosen the path of the wicked, and we have ended up in a place that we can't seem to get out of. We feel that we're drowning in our circumstances. We feel that all of the sin and the unrighteousness that we have chosen is now mounting up against us. Or maybe this is our circumstance. We've been going along choosing the path of the righteous. We're trying to do the right things, but something external to us has come into our lives and has afflicted us in some way. So maybe it's that job loss, or maybe it's financial difficulty, or maybe it's chronic sickness. That doesn't happen because we've chosen it. We've been trying to do the right thing, but these trials have come into our lives. And when they do, so often we don't see any way out. We can't even see past the end of the day because we're enduring so much physical pain. Or we've got so many bills mounting up because of our hospitalization charges. We don't see how we're ever going to be able to pay for all these bills that have mounted up. How are we ever going to survive this? And we come into this trial and we don't see any way out. It's in those moments where our vision is limited because of the uncertainty of tomorrow. What happens? Fear overtakes. And fear begins to push out our faith. Fear begins to creep in and whisper into our ear and say, you're not strong enough to handle this. You're not ready for this kind of a challenge. You might as well give up now. And so in these situations where we just can't see any way out, that inability that we have to see beyond our troubles, it often leads to instability. But brother and sister in Christ, we need to take comfort in the fact that we know somebody who can see beyond our trials and our problems, can't we? Amen. I'm going in my Bible to Isaiah chapter 46. Isaiah 46. I'll give you a few moments to find it. Isaiah 46. I love this passage and what is said here about the Lord. Isaiah chapter 46, I want to begin reading at verse 8, where God says, remember this and be assured. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things long past, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me. Notice verse 10, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things which have not been done, saying, my purpose will be established, and I will accomplish all my good pleasure. God says, I know the end from the very beginning. I can see how all of this is going to work out even before it gets started. You ever been driving on I-85, stuck in a traffic jam, where you've just sat there for 30 minutes or more? Maybe it wasn't I-85, maybe it was I-65 in Birmingham. I'll tell you where it was, most likely. It was Atlanta. That's where it always happens. It was Atlanta, that wretched city. I told Stacy a long time ago, if a church from Atlanta ever asked me to move there, the answer is no. I don't care how many lost people are there. I'm not fighting that traffic. You know I say that in jest. The fact that you're laughing indicates that. I've been there. And you know what often happens as we're stuck in traffic and we're sitting there squirming, getting restless, trying to figure out what's going on. What do people start doing? You know, we kind of inch over to the shoulder and we try to peek around and see, but we can't because we're backed up for miles. And nobody can rubberneck that far. And then it just gets exacerbated by the screaming children in the back seat. At least that's what happens with us. You know, we sit there in that traffic jam and we say, what is going on? I'm kind of wondering that too because my clicker's jumping ahead of me. All right. Guys, carry me back to a black slide, please. Thank you. But we sit there in that traffic jam and we say, well, what's happened? There's a bottleneck up there. So is it because of an accident? Was there a car crash up there? Is there construction going on the interstate? What's going on? We're sitting there and we can only see so far, right? But then you hear this helicopter flying overhead. And what's his vision? Well, he sees the whole thing. He knows exactly what's going on up there. And so you look up and you see that News Channel 4 helicopter driving around up there, flying around, I should say. And on the TV, everybody else knows what's going on because the helicopter is saying, yep, we've got a great view of this. We can see what's going on. There was an accident on Interstate 85. Emergency crews are already there. They're clearing everything out. This should be opening up soon. But you're sitting there in the car and you have no idea. Does that help you understand Isaiah 46:10 a little better? You see, when we're going through trials and difficulties in life, it's like we're sitting there on the interstate in that traffic jam. We can only see so far. We have no idea how this is all going to work out in the end. But there's God up in that helicopter, and He sees the whole thing. He knows exactly how this is going to work out. And so what helps me in this is to know that He's up there and that He's able to see the end from the beginning. Now the challenge for me then is to have enough faith in Him to trust that He's going to see me through it. And so that brings us into chapter 11. This chapter is about having enough faith to see the invisible. Having enough faith in God to see, and I put that in quotation marks, maybe that might help us, enough faith in God to be able to see what we can't actually see. And so Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, again, another passage that you could probably quote from the time you were a small child. It says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." Let me suggest to you that Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 is not really a definition of faith. I know a lot of people appeal to it because it says, "Now faith is," and then gives the rest of the verse and say, well, what is faith? Well, the Bible says faith is, and I don't think this is really a working definition that the Hebrew writer is trying to give us. I think what this actually is the thesis statement of a chapter that highlights one very important aspect of faith. There are other aspects that are involved in faith that are not really addressed here in Hebrews chapter 11. And so that's why I say I don't think this is a definition. But what this chapter does is it helps us see the unseen. Because that's really what this chapter is all about, as we'll see in a moment. But in those moments where we can't see past our trials and our problems, how can we ever overcome them when we aren't able to clearly see the future? When we don't see the way out, when we don't see the good things that might perhaps come from this trial that I'm going through, when we can't see any of that, how is it that we are able to walk by faith instead of trying to walk by sight, as 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7 tells us? How do we do that? Well, this chapter can help us. Maybe your translation in verse 1, instead of saying assurance, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, maybe your translation says it is the substance of things hoped for. I like that. I'm kind of a word nerd. I take an interest in where words come from and their etymologies and the backgrounds of the words. When you look at the word substance, it's a pretty important word. You have a prefix, sub, which means under, and then you have the word stance, which of course means stand. And so you have sub, stand, standing under, stands under. It's really the idea of substance. And so we talk about politicians who stand on TV and they talk about their programs and their initiatives and their laws, and we say, yeah, but it didn't really have any substance. What do we mean? We mean it didn't have any foundational points to undergird it. It didn't really have any strength to it. It didn't have anything that stood under it. And the Hebrew writer says that what stands under us is our faith. Faith is the substance. It is what stands under us to help us endure trials and stay true to the Lord. And so many of the people here in chapter 11 were able to rely upon their faith, which was the substance of their very being. And it is through their faith that many of the people in Hebrews chapter 11 were able to see that which is invisible. Many of the people in this chapter, God made significant promises to them. But many of the people never saw those promises. They never received those things. And so let me just give you some examples. It says in verse 1 that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's an important expression in this chapter. For by faith the men of old gained approval. And he's about to walk us through a number of men of faith and some women. But notice verse 3. By faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. We look around us and we see the creation of God, but the creation that God made is made out of things that you can't actually see. Now look at verse 7. By faith Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen. In reverence he prepared an ark for the salvation of his household. God comes to Noah and he says, Noah, there's going to be rain such as you've never seen before. And there might even be reason to believe that a drop of rain has never fallen on the earth when the flood begins. Things not seen. And yet what does Noah do? He trusts God. God has made this promise. Storm is coming. And if you'll build the ark, you'll be spared. And Noah trusts that, even though he's never seen what God is about to do. Look at verse 8. By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. May I suggest to you that's another way of saying he didn't see it. He went out not knowing where he was going. He wasn't able to see where God was taking him. Then in verse 11, by faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Now that verse doesn't talk anything about vision, but you need to think a little bit about the circumstances of that story. Abraham and Sarah have no children. They're both advanced in years. God makes a promise to them that they're going to have a child. And Sarah is thinking to herself, oh really? And how's that going to happen? Because when you get to be my age, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. But God made a promise. And so she was able to see that when God makes a promise, it's going to happen. Look at verse 13. All these, that's the ones who were mentioned previously, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Without receiving these promises, but they saw them. Through the eyes of faith, they put their hope and their trust in God who made the promise to them, and they saw the unseen. Abraham is visited again in verse 17. And this talks about when he was ready to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice to God. And it says in verse 19 that Abraham considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead. Has Abraham ever seen God raise somebody from the dead before? At least not according to the biblical record. But he is able to see beyond the trial that God is putting him through. And he says, I don't understand all of this, but if I do what God says, perhaps God can raise him from the dead, and maybe that's what he's going to do. And so Abraham is willing to go through with this because he sees the unseen. Verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau even regarding things to come. Things that Isaac himself will never see, but his great descendants will. Verse 22, this one has always been striking to me. Joseph. By faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the exodus of the sons of Israel and gave orders concerning his bones. Of all of the great moments in Joseph's life, Potiphar's wife and his stand against her temptations. When he interprets those dreams, and he comes before Pharaoh, and he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and he rises to power in Egypt. All these great moments in Joseph's history, and the Hebrew writer says, yeah, but what I want to talk about is when he made the people promise to carry his bones out of the land of Egypt. Why? Because Joseph knew he would never see the promised land. He said, I'm not going to live to see it, but you're going to take me there. What's he doing? He's seeing the invisible. He is seeing that which God had promised. Verse 27. By faith, when Moses left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. Moses, through the eyes of faith, was able to see God who cannot be seen. And he chose significant life choices because of this clear vision that he had. Well, finally, look at verse 39. And all of these, having gained approval through their faith, did not receive what was promised. You see, all of these people had been given promises by God, and they didn't even receive those promises in their own lifetimes. But they acted in accordance with their faith because they saw that when God makes a promise, He's going to stand by His word, and I need to trust Him. So what does this mean for us? It means in times of trial and hardship, it is easy to get discouraged. Think about some of the circumstances that these people in Hebrews chapter 11 went through. Think about Abraham, who was about to offer Isaac as a sacrifice to God. You want to talk about difficulty of trial? And so when we are faced with difficulties and trials, it's easy for us to get weak, to waver in our faith through our discouragement. So how do we find a way out of troubles when we can't seem to see into the future? Only walking by faith will let us do that. If our faith is strong, then I don't have to know all of the answers about tomorrow. I don't have to have every T crossed and every I dotted to say, now God, you show me how you're going to see me through this, and then I'll trust you to do it. That's walking by sight. That's not walking by faith and trust in God. And so we say to God, I can't see everything. I'm down here in my car on the interstate, but you're up there and you see it all. And if you tell me to trust you, I'm going to do it. And folks, when we do that, that's how we remain steadfast and immovable. Because faith is the basis for our stability. I think we need to take great courage from this chapter. I hope we read this chapter a lot and be reminded of God's promises and how we can trust them no matter how difficult it may seem. So if you're here this morning and you've never placed your trust and your conviction in God by becoming a Christian and being a follower of Jesus, we're here to help you this morning to do that very thing. Or if you need to come back to Jesus and renew your commitment to Him, we're ready to assist you. Please come as we stand and sing together.